2, presented by the Professional and Independent Agents Association of Ohio. Your presenter today, again, is Jackie Reindl, CIC, CPIA, CPIW, member of the National Faculty of CIC, as well as teaching CISR, pre-licensing courses, other CE, ethics, E&O. And we're going to continue our conversation today on elements of a disaster response plan. Previously, we talked about what is a disaster, what constitutes a disaster, both from the physical, the mental, the plant, the business. We talked a lot about human reactions. So we kind of got into what we were going to do once something happened and the position of the insurance agent once something happened. Now we're going to talk about how to prevent, identifying prevention elements of a disaster plan, and talk about response, recovery, and in essence, it's going to happen. We need to prepare for it. And as the insurance agent, that's part of your job, is helping your clients get ready for a disaster, recover from a disaster, and move on with life after a disaster. So let's begin with prevention. And while it may seem strange, the idea of prevention is first take into consideration what could happen. And to do that, you have to identify all possible exposures with your clients. That means utilizing a checklist from your agency, because a good checklist identifies everything that is an exposure for the client. Everything from furniture to the building itself to what's in the building, plant facilities, people, liability exposures. What is exposed for that business? What, if damaged, could harm them? So you have to use a really good commercial lines checklist, identify all exposures with your clients, and by the way, from experience I can tell you, this may mean a little disagreement, because your clients may come up with, that's a once in a blue moon kind of thing, and that may be true. But is it possible that it could happen? And if it's possible, then we have to identify it and the potential ramifications of that once in a blue moon. Doesn't mean we have to insure it, and that a good agent knows as well. Everything doesn't have to be insured, but we have to identify every possible thing that could contribute to the economic detriment of the business. And then we can look at possible scenarios. If, for example, we're in a cold weather climate, is a possible scenario ice damage, snow damage? Is wind a possible scenario? Is your plant, is your building close enough to a road of any nature where there might be a vehicular type of accident that could impact your business? What would happen? Do you have just one employee who does an all-important critical function in your business? What would happen if that a key employee suffered death or disability? What would happen if the owner did? So you have to look at all possible scenarios. And once you've looked at all possible scenarios, then you have to look at the improbable scenarios, because it is true, stuff happens. Weird stuff happens. Who would think that a deer might come running into your business? Who would think that a herd of cattle might decide to wander into your door? Who would think that your business is where an altercation may take place, either between individuals or between an outlaw and the police? You have to look at not only what might happen, but what just may never happen, possibly, but will. So improbable scenarios are as necessary to look at as possible scenarios. because it's the once-in-a-lifetime thing, the once-in-a-blue-moon kind of thing, the thing we think that will never happen, that we're not prepared for, and which can end up destroying a business. So we have to look at all scenarios. Then when it comes to the planning, key element, and again, this can lead to some slight disagreements. Who's going to do the planning? Quite often the owner of the business believes that he or she should be the one doing the planning, and you can't always disagree. That might be best. But quite often the owner of the business has an overview, and sometimes it's necessary for employees who are looking more at the trees, not just the forest, to be in on the planning. You're never going to kick the owner out, and I'm never saying that's a good idea to kick the owner out, but it is a really good idea to bring in other people into the planning session because they're the ones who are going to be involved in the implementation. They're quite often the ones that know the daily knit and grit of the business and who will know and be able to bring some other possible scenarios as to what might happen and what the impact and ramifications might be of that improbable scenario. So who's going to plan is going to be important. And then it is not a good idea to bring in too many planners, because too many people create chaos when it comes to thinking. And clear, concise thinking and planning is critical for a disaster response plan. Bring in experts. There are government experts. You can get hold of people like FEMA, who will have a good idea of how to prepare for an emergency and a good disaster response plan. You have local disaster management teams and departments that will have a good idea on how to plan because they've been through this. And quite often, why bother reinventing the wheel? If we have experts who have been through this, who have been through the storms, bring them in. They can help shorten the process and bring concise, real-life scenarios to the process. The internet, again, is a great place to look up plans. Now, again, one has to be careful. There are free things out there, and it is often true that you get what you pay for when you pay nothing. On the other hand, there are companies who allege that they specialize in disaster planning. There is a real good crowd in between that are reasonable, that are truly experts, that have templates for planning, that have checklists for planning, that have lists of what is necessary for various kinds of disasters to have on hand. So bring in some experts and look for experts. These are important. Insurance companies, bring them in, agents. They've probably helped you prepare a plan. They have an idea of what they're going to be looking for after a disaster. And if the client is prepared with what the companies want, it will make the recovery a lot faster. So there are experts in every level, in all types of resources available. So there's nothing wrong with saying that we don't know everything, and we can bring in people who do. So again, figure out who's going to plan in the business, and then bring in people to help with that plan. But try not to make the group get too big. Too many conflicting ideas means that probably nothing will get done. The response. When there's a disaster plan, part of that plan is who is going to respond. Now, it would be great if the owner took the initial responsibility. However, the owner isn't necessarily the appropriate person to do it. One of the things that I like to take into consideration when you're looking at who's going to do the initial responsibility after some kind of crisis is who has the coolest head. Who's able to keep their head in a crisis? If this is not a place for drama queens, and quite frankly, some drama queens are male, But this is a time for the cool-headed response, the person who can be dispassionate but empathetic at the same time, who does not panic at time of crisis, who can go, oh yes, I know where the plan is, I know where the response is, let me get it, and I have a lot of it in my head, but let me get the backup to make sure. So the initial responsibility has to be somebody who has the ability to take charge, the ability to encourage others to get the job done, and has the ability to stand up to whoever needs a little push and a little push out of the way. So that may or may not be the owner of the business. This is time for frank discussion with the owner to determine who in that small business is going to take charge after a disaster. The next thing that has to be done is to prioritize employees. In a small, very small business, prioritization may not be as critical because everybody's going to have a job. However, in a slightly larger to larger small business, employees need to be prioritized in terms of who gets contacted first, and then in what order, who is assigned a job to do, and in what order, who's going to deal on the phone with other employees, with customers, who's going to be responsible for dealing with the insurance company, who's going to be responsible for dealing with any media that has to be dealt with, who's going to be responsible for dealing with cleanup, who's going to be responsible for all the jobs that have to be done after a disaster hits. There's going to be plenty of work for everyone, but the idea is to match the employee with the task that needs to be done. And this means that someone in the office, someone in the business needs to be familiar with employees and their capabilities and their responses and their temperament. So part of the initial responsibility is knowing the employees, prioritizing the employees with the tasks that need to be done. And that sounds a lot easier than it is because many of us have never seen fellow employees in a crisis. So we're not sure how they would react. The other thing to remember when you're prioritizing employees is that quite often they're going to have their own stuff to deal with. So if you have an employee who has, for example, disabled relatives they're dealing with, or who lives some distance from the office, it would be important to give that employee a task afterwards, but what's manageable from their location or with their constrictions. So again, it's knowing who the employees are, what they will be doing, how they'll be able to react, any restrictions or constrictions on each employee following a disaster. And obviously things can change, and some of this may have to be done on the fly. If you had an employee designated, for example, to be in charge of cleanup, but they were injured or disabled by the disaster, then you're going to have to be able to be flexible. But prioritizing employees, who gets called back, for what purpose, is important to pay attention to when you're looking at a response, because how your employees react in a small business is going to help determine how well the business recovers. Then you need to prioritize contacts. Who is it important for the business to contact first? Hopefully insurance agent, they have your name right up front, right up top, to let you know that something's happened. Beyond that, once we get that ball rolling, small business, what's next? Probably some type of cleanup. Sorry, I forgot a really important key. First responders may come before anybody. So first responders might be in there before anybody else, but given that, then agent, now who else is key to cleanup, to restoration, to repairs, to getting the business up and running? Those names should be handy and should be available to the employee or employees who have been designated to head up that responsibility. The owner probably is going to want to contact business connections. Do I have contracts with somebody that I'm not going to be able to fulfill in the short run? Those phone calls are going to be critical to make as soon as possible, or those contacts as soon as possible, because we want the other end of our business dealings to know that we're going to be available for them, and potentially when we're going to be available. And if we're not going to be available, what's the alternative? And again, this is all part of the planning. If I'm destroyed, if my building is on the ground, if I cannot recover within a week or two or a month, what's going to happen? Who might I possibly lose that I need to deal with? So prioritizing contacts is another key element in getting ready as a response to disaster. Then we can turn our attention, since we've done all of our planning, we've got everybody on a job, they're ready to go, now we can turn our attention to recovery. First and foremost, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for my building, for my people, for my physical assets? We, as insurance agents, the first thing we think of is we went through that checklist with them, we looked at all possible scenarios, we made sure that they understood the need for insurance as in as many cases as possible. Insurance is the first response most of us think of. And fortunately, that's the first response most of your clients think of, because you have prepared them, you've showed them the best policies and the best way to deal with anything that happens. However, insurance is not always the response. Sometimes in preparation for disasters, we can look at risk management techniques. There's a risk management response that we can look at both here and in the planning stages. We can identify the exposures. Remember, we talked about identifying the possible scenarios, identifying the probable scenarios and the improbable scenarios. Risk management response is great here. Identifying them, what are we going to look at? Next, as part of the risk management, we need to measure those exposures. How likely is it that something is going to happen? As in, how often? Frequency. If your business is in Tornado Alley, well, we ought to be looking at when is a kind of a frequent visitor. On the other hand, if my business is in Georgia, how likely is it, how often is it that I'm going to be hit with ice or snow? So you need to measure the frequency of the various scenarios. And frequency is going to help determine whether insurance is the correct response or whether another risk management technique would be a response. Another thing I might look at when I'm measuring is severity. What is the likelihood that if this, whatever this is, happens, that it could destroy me? Would it just be an inconvenience, a major inconvenience, or destruction? So severity versus frequency. Obviously, if it's not going to happen too often, then maybe I don't need to insure it. Maybe I can do a separation. Maybe I can do a duplicate, some way other than insurance. And by the way, as an insurance agent, I know that quite often recommending a non-insurance method actually gets me more business. It's funny how that works out sometimes. If it's a matter of severity, are there any kind of loss control techniques that we can use, encourage the client to use to reduce the severity should something happen? Once again, some of the techniques might be duplicates or separation of assets so that only some are damaged. Or if they're all damaged, I'm ready to go with a duplicate. So the different risk management techniques: identify, measure. We can look at the alternatives. If the scenario is likely to happen and I figured out how to fund it, is there any way that I can use another way, an alternative to money. So again, back to the duplicates or separations is one way. How about just avoiding something? It's not something that businesses often want to look at, but quite frankly, sometimes if that's going to hurt me often, maybe I don't need it. So once we have established what's exposed, what could happen, what it might cost, then I need to look at implementing whatever scenarios, whatever solutions we decided was a good thing. So it does no good to identify everything that could be damaged by what could happen to it if we don't then take steps to implement the procedures that we decided were best, whether it's insurance, avoidance, loss control or techniques, whatever. If they're not implemented, then we've wasted our time. And I'm sure as an agent you have better things to do than waste your time, and your client certainly does. So then after we put it in place, the last element of a good risk management technique is to monitor it. Is it working? Does it still work? As a business grows or changes, what worked a year ago may not work today. So monitoring what we put in place, monitoring to see if the exposures are the same, to see if the scenarios are still the same. Maybe they've made changes to their physical plant that made one of the scenarios more unlikely. So we can change it out of the probably going to happen, so probably need to insure it, to another method of risk management. So it has to be monitored on a regular basis. And agent, that's one of the things we can encourage them to do. And if we tie it in with, and you know it will save you money to do this, they listen much more likely and more readily. Identify assistance resources ahead of time. Once a disaster happens, everybody's busy. So if we can identify who we might need, what we might need before the disaster happens, the more likely we are to recover more quickly. So if, for example, I have vendors that I deal with on a regular basis, I need to make sure those vendors are going to be available when I need them. Now, if they're in the same area, same community that I'm in, then it's much more likely that I need to find an equivalent vendor outside the area and set up some kind of contingency plan with them. Whether it's IT, whether it's construction, whatever the assistance might be needed has to be identified and set up ahead of time. Because as I said, if you've ever tried to buy lumber when you actually need it, it's scarce because everybody else in your area is wanting the same thing. And all the contractors are going to be busy, all the IT people are going to be busy, all the plumbers, whatever the need is, if you're needing it and disaster hits, probably everybody else is going to need the same thing you're going to need. So setting up contingency plans ahead of time will save you time and money at time of disaster. Then we can look at training. All right, so we've taken a look at our plan, we're kind of setting it up, and we've identified some of the items, some of the people we're going to need afterwards, but it all falls flat if nobody knows anything about it. So businesses need to train their employees. Now, the question is, who gets trained? Worked for a carrier that had 22 floors, and on every floor there was an emergency manager. The sole job of, not the sole job, but the job of that person in case of disaster of any kind was to kind of take charge of the floor and everybody on it, and there was somebody, also an assistant, if you will, in case that person happened to be out on the day. So there has to be training. Identify who needs to be trained. This is back to temperament. This is back to personality. This is back to Does this person get along with everybody? Because in case of emergency, there's not probably going to be time to consider the personalities of everybody involved. So who's going to be trained is critical. If you're in a small business, it might only be the one person with a backup. If you're in a medium-sized business, then you may have to go with more than one or two people. But all training should be equivalent so that everybody knows what to do. What kind of training is required? Kind of depends on resources. There are generally free seminars several times throughout the year, throughout every state, throughout counties, for emergency or disaster training. So you can determine if there is, do you want it to go as simple as CPR? Do you want to go as far as first responder training? Do you want to have people who are volunteers with first responders? What kind of training do you need or want? Does someone need to be trained to work with first responders? Does someone need to be trained to work with other crisis management people? So what kind of training, who's going to be trained, what kind of training is required, and then you have to consider attrition. The small business takes all the steps they need to train the emergency personnel in their office, and then that person leaves. Almost guaranteed disaster will strike soon. So when there is a possibility of someone leaving, voluntarily or otherwise, retiring, then someone else needs to be backup trained. So that there is the manual we'll talk about soon. All training should be done in double, so that no matter what happens to the primary trained person, there is a backup, and so should something happen, nothing's going to fall through the cracks. So training is going to be critical. It's not enough just to presume that somebody will know what to do. Because remember, we can go back to the first webinar, and there's those reactions we have to take into account, the panic and denial, and oh my gosh, now what? And the training that's required is going to need to be to the point where somebody doesn't succumb to those emotions, be able to push them aside and follow through. Plan development. This is critical. It's got to be in writing. There's absolutely no wiggle room here. If it's not in writing, then somebody or somebodies have it in their head. And that means that everybody else doesn't have it. And if it's in someone's head and that person's not present when the disaster happens, there may as well be no plan. So the plan has got to be in writing. Where can you... Then there's got to be multiple copies of the plan. You can't just have one that ends up at the bottom of a pile of rubble. Then you've got to review the plan at least annually or seasonally prior to the catastrophe. It doesn't do any good to go looking for the manual after the disaster happens. So let's take a look at each of these. So writing a plan, got to be in writing. There's no acceptable alternative to it being in writing. And I am talking about, even when we talk format, if it's in computer, it should also be in writing, because one or the other should be available. So we have it in writing. Where do you go to get a plan? Go to the local government agencies. They want businesses to have a plan. They don't want, nor does the national government, neither of those entities want every business in town contacting them after a disaster, because they have things of their own that they have to take care of. So go to your local government agency ahead of time and say, because there's a FEMA, there's a disaster management arm of every local government. Go to that local government ahead of time and say, do you have a checklist? Do you have a template? Do you have a plan for this city, this county, and where can I get my hands on it, and a template for me to create my own business plan, my own disaster response plan, in conjunction with what you guys already have planned. National government agencies, FEMA, really would like everybody to have a plan, because they come in after the fact, you're there during the fact, and you need help before FEMA can get there. So they have templates, they have procedures, they have plans available, and if you go on the websites, they're free. Now again, back to the training, back to resources, you may think that free is not necessarily good, but it's a start, and is certainly better than no plan at all. And having reviewed these plans, they're a very, very good start. Does any kind of trade association or business association affiliated with your type of business, whether it's construction, dry cleaning, bicycles, have anything available? Check with them, because many of those business associations have resources available to members. Check with your always check with the insurance agency, because they have access, don't we agents, to all kinds of resources through our trade associations like PIIA, or the national organization, or our insurance carriers also have such plans available, because again, they want to come into a business recovering, not a business devastated. So the resources for these written plans, just innumerable. There's no excuse for a small business not to have a plan in writing, even if they fill in the blanks with their own name. There are plans out there available, absolutely necessary. Now, how do we format this plan? Written, that's great, put it in a manual. But if you're going to put it in a manual, there has to be multiple copies. And again, I'm the kind that recommends, even if I'm going to do it electronic, I want it written as well. And I want that written and one of the other format kept somewhere other than the office, so that I have access to it, or somebody has access to it on a regular basis and in case of disaster. On the written format, you can do it in manual. Updated copies go to the owner, naturally, managers, supervisory personnel, and in some central location that's accessible to everybody. And there should be some kind of ceremony or something that lets every employee know where this manual is. In case of a disaster, here's the guidelines, here's the rules. So that's critical, that every employee has access to it. And if you're feeling generous, small business, make a manual for every employee and suggest they take it home. And that's another nice little process for the employees, because it may encourage them to make a disaster plan for their own homes. And that way, back to benefiting the company, they'll be accessible and available for you, the business, because they'll be able to get their own stuff on the road to recovery faster, which makes them available to you a lot faster. So that's kind of a selfish reason, but that's okay. Businesses, it's all right to be a little selfish sometimes. If you're going to do an electronic, whether you do it on a CD-ROM, whether you do it on jump drives, does not matter. All right? You can have it on the mainframe, but make copies available by CD, by jump drive, through email, don't care, to the same kind of key personnel that you did the written format to. And again, when you updated copies go to the same personnel. If you have changed vendors, if you've changed contacts, emergency contacts, the plan needs to be updated, back to whoever's in charge of it. Needs to be updated, updated copies sent. It's no good to have outdated information in an emergency. There have to be multiple copies of the plan. If this is written, regularly updated copies get sent to key personnel, again, who are these people: owners, managers, supervisory, and again, that central location for everybody if you're not going to make a copy to send home with everybody. That way, the nice thing about sending copies home with everybody is everybody has one no matter where they're contacted following a disaster. And everybody's home is not going to be destroyed at once. If electronic, again, regularly updated to key personnel, same personnel. And the reason we want to put on some kind of CD-ROM or jump drive is so it can be used outside the facility that may have been destroyed. On laptops or tablets or other electronic devices, you want to have access to this as the key element here. Next, on plan development, review the plan annually and prior to disaster. Now, there's different schools of thought on this. One school of thought says that there ought to be drills, that this should be practiced, it should be reviewed, practiced again, at least 3 or 4 times a year. Now, if you're going to do seasonally, it may end up being more than around 3 or 4 times a year, because come spring, most parts of the country are susceptible to tornadoes or other wind events. Come fall, a large portion of the country is due to major wind events called hurricanes. Earthquakes, of course, excuse me, can happen anytime. Fires can happen anytime. So reviewing just once a year allows for lapse in memory. And it's no good to have the annual review scheduled for tomorrow if the disaster hits today. Excuse me. So, on the review, it is a really good idea to again have whoever's initial responsibility, whether it's the owner or some other key employee, be in charge of this meeting and walk through the disaster plan. And the reason that we walk through it is so that all people involved here, which should be the majority of employees or at least the supervisory personnel who will then translate and communicate to the employees, we want them involved for any kind of changes, anything that has altered in since the last review. Oh, by the way, did you forget we added the second location? Oh, by the way, did you know that so-and-so, whose responsibility was this, is no longer here? So the idea behind a review is to go through it all. And if you are doing it seasonally because there are certain things that are coming up, then that's the particular item that should be paid attention to. We should go back over, the business should go back over the possible scenarios again. Start basically at the beginning as if you're planning from scratch, because that way we have a chance to review each time to see if there's anything we miss, to see if maybe someone doesn't feel up to the responsibility anymore, to see if they simply don't want to do it anymore, that their circumstances have changed. So it's a good idea to start at the beginning of the plan and go through. And again, at least annually, but certainly seasonally. Practice and review are basic and critical elements of the preparedness plan. Yes, it is. However, practice may mean a drill. Now, how do you drill for a tornado? Obviously, you don't want to have the building torn down to do that. But the idea behind the review and the practice is to walk every employee through potential scenarios. If, for example, name the disaster, doesn't matter what it is, if this should happen, where would you go? Where's this meeting place, and who contacts who, and who contacts first responders, who does this, whose job is it to shut down the computers, whose job is it to turn off the utilities. The practice and review starts with a drill of who does what. Once you've determined that, Then you can walk through the rest of the procedure. So from the practical, and it's going to seem silly because we've all been through the fire drills and we all think they're just a waste of time until the fire happens. Constant practice or repeated practice tends to bring people back on board to the program. And if it's possible, during this practice, during this review, during the drill, to have scenarios that have happened near your business, that makes it all the more real. Ask any employee who's been through something to tell their story. This should not be a simple 5-minute, here's the plan, you all know it, nothing's changed, go back to work. This should be treated just as importantly as any other element of your business plan. Because if you don't have people prepared, if the plan isn't in place and practiced and ready, then in effect you've turned your business over to whatever may happen to it. So any other element of your business plan is geared towards profitability. So is this. This is just as important as any funding or anything else that may happen with your business. So practice and review basic and critical elements. By the way, it is quite possible that if you ask the first responders in your community, in the place where you live, they will help you practice and they will help you drill. They will come out to your facility, to your business, and help you walk through a drill. Another idea is to contact first responders and see when they're holding an emergency preparedness drill, and see if you can get you or any of your clients and their employees involved in that drill. They're always looking for some kind of volunteers to play injured people, and it's a great way for participants and for members of the community to take part and to review what's done on a professional basis and what of that can I translate back to my business. So agents, as a review for this plan thing, the idea here is to first go through with your clients the possible scenarios and probable scenarios after you've gone through the checklist of any potential exposures. The next idea is then to convince them to put a plan together. Bring your knowledge, bring your resources to bear. You have many more resources than the average small business, so you do have that capability of providing them with resources that they will be able to use. Then convince them that a plan needs to be in writing. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. Determine who in the business, with obviously the owner's input, their idea of who is best capable of handling the initial responsibility of putting the plan into action should disaster strike. This is critical to getting the job done and getting the business back up and running. The responsibility in the wrong hands is simply going to make the job more difficult. Then, in writing, distribute the plan to everybody so that there is no one in that office, in that business, that does not know where the plan is. This would also be a good reminder point for the client to have that emergency kit, that emergency preparedness kit ready and available, so that whoever has the initial responsibility knows where that kit is, knows what to distribute to who, knows who to call first, and to move on from there. The last thing that you want to take a look at here, as we've discussed in this portion of the webinar, is to review and practice. I know that a lot of employees do think it's silly to run through the drills. However, practice makes perfect, and it is a good idea for employees to be able, should they hear the alarm go off, should they hear the siren go off, should they be contacted on the calling tree, or however the contact is made, to know immediately and without hesitation where they should go, what they should do, who they're supposed to contact. So should the tornado hit tomorrow, there's no doubt about who I contact, where I go, what I do. It's my responsibility to do this, just start doing it. Those practice sessions are critical. Finally, as we wind up this part of the webinar, we've now gone through 2 sessions here where we talked about the preparedness mentally, preparedness physically, and the impacts of disasters on us as both humans and professionally. The second set here, we kind of dealt with trying to offset the effects of section 1 of the webinar. How do we prepare ourselves so that we are ready to deal with the physical aspects, the devastation of the disaster, and the mental aspects, and then how to get into recovery. On the next part, 2 parts of the seminar, we're going to talk about, okay, we know it's going to happen, how do we prevent as much damage as possible? Before we get into that, just a reminder that we are dealing with people. Every business is made up of people, and as agents, part of our job is to know those people, know our clients, understand their psychology and their methodology. So if we're going to be good insurance agents, which I know we all are, what we then need to do is be prepared ourselves. So agents, I'm going to ask again, do you as an agency have a disaster plan? Do you have your kit ready, and when's the last time you practiced? Who's in charge in your office of implementing any disaster plan you may have in place? Does that person have a backup? Is your plan in writing? Is your plan backed up electronically? Who has a copy of the plan? Who are your priority contacts? When you're dealing as an agency, do you have a list of all your carriers? Do you have their preparedness plan? Or at least do you know who you're supposed to contact in case of an emergency or disaster at your agency plant? What are your carrier guidelines for dealing with claims in case of disaster? This is keeping in mind, agencies, that most of our agencies are small businesses. So who is going to keep the claim log? Who is going to decide what needs to be inspected? Who's going to be in charge if all electronics go down and you have to take claims manually? Who's going to be in charge of making sure that all the claim forms are filled out correctly and appropriately? Who's going to talk to clients about what's covered and what's not covered? Our tendency in a disaster as agents is to tell our clients, we got you. We're here to take care of you. And sometimes that enthusiasm, that desire to help our clients leads us to say things that we will regret later. For example, debris removal for a business. How much is in your client's policy for that? What is your carrier's philosophy on getting as much cleaned up as quickly as possible? Is the debris removal the standard 25% of the loss? Is that going to be sufficient? What are your carrier's positions on contact? Which carriers in your office, agents, which carriers respond fastest? And do you know how quickly they respond and what kind of information you're able to give to your clients to keep them calm and focused and working until the carrier's adjuster can get out there? Are you prepared to keep a single catastrophe log so that it has as least an impact on your loss ratio as possible, because you'll know which ones go into that catastrophe log? Who has been trained in your office to answer questions from clients? And this is important because, again, as an agent, just like we encourage the business to know their people, you need to know your people as an agency, because everyone is not designed to handle stress or to answer questions in stressful times. So it's a really good idea to know ahead of time who's going to be able to answer questions correctly, calmly, and keep clients in the mode of working towards recovery and getting them out of the mode of panic and that frozen state that your clients are going to get into, because that's normal. So determining who in your agency is the initial responsibility is not just about responding to your own disaster, but responding to your clients' disasters as well. So you need someone there who's going to be pretty well trained in coverage issues, who is comfortable and calm when dealing with clients who are in a stress mode. Also someone who may not be too bogged down with their own disaster issues. So if you have someone who has all those other complications in their life, that's probably not the person you want handling clients after a disaster. So as we deal with our clients, we need to hold the mirror up to ourselves as an agency and see how well we're prepared to deal with it. Because if we're not prepared, we're not going to be any help to our clients. One of the things I talk about in one of the next webinars is about getting your agency operational first. I know the first instinct is to help clients, but unless we help ourselves and get ourselves back in order, we're not going to be as useful to our clients as we could be. And we want to be able to help as we promised we'd help, but without getting ourselves in order first, that's simply not going to happen. So before we take this and running to our clients with here's a great benefit I have for you as your agent, this is going to help you recover as sure as the insurance I sold you is going to, we need to take a look and see what we've done for ourselves. How well are our people all prepared to deal with our clients' disasters and get ourselves back in order before they get back in order. So I'm hoping that some of this information is going to be useful to you, and the nice thing is this is just a start. I'm hoping that all the resources we're giving you through the government, through SBA, through Red Cross, are also going to be extremely useful to you as you move on with helping your clients get ready for disasters. Have a good day.